For more than 50 years, Zbigniew Brzezinski has been one of the most influential thinkers and actors in setting U.S. global policy. He advised Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Reagan. He recruited the then little-known governor of Georgia to the shadowy Trilateral Commission and went on to become President Carter's national security advisor from 1976 to 1980. Brzezinski was at the center of U.S. power during the fall of the Shah of Iran, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, the normalization of relations with the People's Republic of China, the building of the MX missile, and the Camp David Accords. In his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski laid out in surprisingly unambiguous language his vision for America and the world. For America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. America's withdrawal from the world, or because of sudden emergence of a successful rival, would produce massive international instability. It would prompt global anarchy. The most immediate task is to make certain that no state or a combination of states gains the capacity to expel the United States from Eurasia or even to diminish significantly its decisive arbitration role. I interviewed Professor Brzezinski at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, where he's a resident scholar. The question: why is the United States fighting a war in Afghanistan? Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, D.C. And joining us now is Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
The argument in the book, if I try to paraphrase a little bit, is that the United States, in order to oppose forces of what you call global anarchy, for the sake of world stability, needs to maintain its dominance in the world for a generation or even longer. And the key to this dominance is Eurasia. Eurasian strategy for the United States is, essentially, you say, will determine whether or not it remains preeminent. What is America's Eurasia strategy right now? And what is the Afghan war, what's its role in this?
Let me just add that in the book, I also say that American preeminence may not endure indefinitely, and that in fact, if we conduct policies that are unwise, that are historically, so to speak, out of tune with the times, we could fumble the ball, so to speak. And I'm afraid that to some extent that concern is now being validated. Namely that in the wake of 9/11, we responded in a fashion that aggravated the challenge and that engaged us in an undertaking, the end of which is difficult to define, but the consequences of which, if we do not end it somehow before too long, could be devastating. Namely, we are engaged in what I think I call for the first time in this book, but I've called it many times since then the same way. We're engaged in what I call the global Balkans. The Balkans in Europe were that part of Europe which was internally weak, torn by a variety of conflicts, ethnic, religious, and territorial, into which great powers tended to be sucked in. Now the global Balkans extend from east of Suez to west of Xinjiang, to south of Russia's new border, which is north of Kazakhstan, all the way down to the Indian Ocean. It encompasses an area of about 550, 600 million people. And now, sad to say, in that turbulent area, we are the principal protagonist.
And why is it necessary? Why is U.S. dominance in that region important?
Dominance means ability to manage. Being embroiled is not the same thing. I, for example, feel that we have overdone the military involvement. But I do think that our ability to manage the various conflicting interests and powers in this huge continent of Eurasia is central to our stability and security. But it doesn't mean that we have to be engaged militarily.
Now, you talk about the enormous wealth of the region, the importance of pipelines. Why is that important for America to be the arbiter of all of this?
Well, again, I don't say America ought to be the arbiter of this, but I do think that it's important for us to recognize that the management of resources is very important in the distribution of global power, and that other parts of the world in which we have either an interest or a close relationship with, such as the Far East, Japan and China, or in the West, Europe, if they become dependent on a single power, that this could be destructive, damaging, and even precipitate conflicts. And therefore, for example, diversity of sources of energy is a source of security.
What is the Obama Eurasia policy then?
Well, that's a very good question. You ought to ask him.
Well, he was talking to you. Is he still? I don't know. Let me ask you frankly, did he ask your advice on whether to send more troops?
I couldn't, if I said yes, that would be distortion, but I was involved in some fashion in discussions, including within the White House, regarding the decisions he made.
But what do you make of
I
the
don't
thinking?
think that my input was all that significant, because I know from personal experience that the really significant input comes from those people who are on the spot, who interact on a daily basis, who debate the options, engage in them. An advisor who's called in from outside, maybe even just out of politeness, is not a decision maker. So I have no illusions. Now, what do I think of the policy? I think he had no choice. He inherited a situation. The question is, can he now manage it in such a way that it ceases to be an endless morass, something that we get bogged down in? And I think that is the real challenge.
The idea of Eurasia as the key to U.S. global power, is that the driving reason to be in Afghanistan?
No, I think the driving reason to be in Afghanistan, and the specific reason, is that a major attack on the United States originated from a safe haven that existed in Afghanistan. We gave the then Afghan regime, which happens to have been a Taliban regime, the option of either terminating the safe haven and handing over to us those who attacked us, or becoming the object of an unavoidable military action designed to eliminate that safe haven, in particular Al-Qaeda. They chose the latter option. That's why we're in there.
In the book, you talk about the importance of Pakistan and Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and the whole issue of the energy. The argument is made, I mean, obviously you've heard it, that whether Al-Qaeda has a safe haven in Afghanistan or whether it's North Waziristan or whether it's somewhere else, whether it's Hamburg, this can't be just about whether Al-Qaeda has a place to launch attacks from, because it can launch attacks from many places. There has to be something more in terms of this strategic vision.
Well, wait. I don't know whose vision you're talking about, because Obama didn't go into Afghanistan. Someone else did, right?
Right.
8 years ago.
Yeah, although for some reason they didn't give it the same strategic weight that this
Well, they
administration
didn't, but
does.
they went in, and they stayed in. Now, they didn't finish the job, because then they decided to go into something else, namely Iraq in addition to it, which was a rather dubious enterprise. But I think given the circumstances after 9/11, we really didn't have much choice. I mean, the perpetrator was there. He killed 3,000 Americans. He had an organization. We had to eliminate it. The question is what happened after that. I was very marginally involved in that decision, very marginally. Again, a little bit like what I was talking about earlier, namely, I took part in some of the sessions in the Defense Department, the Secretary of Defense, regarding Afghanistan right after 9/11, when a number of us were consulted. But again, I emphasize consultation is not decision-making. It's a process of discussion, sometimes maybe of some use, maybe also to gain support publicly for the stated policy. But I remember conveying my view that, one, we have to go in to eliminate Al-Qaeda, but do not stay in. Because I know what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. And I said, do not stay in. No nation building, democracy promotion, in addition to eliminating Al-Qaeda. Go in, knock them off, and get out. And that is my view, but...
Do you think that's the view of the Pentagon?
I don't know what is the view of the Pentagon now.
Because the Pentagon's, the idea of the need for some kind of long-term basis somewhere in the region...
Oh, no, I don't think that motivated us going to Afghanistan. Believe me, that I do know it was not the case. Now, there was a whole superstructure created by the Bush administration, which was maybe rhetoric or maybe they believed it. You know, it's a little hard to say what they believed in, because they believed in a lot of things which turned out to have been totally untrue. But let's give them credit. They believed in building democracy by force of arms. That's a rather long-term undertaking if you're dealing with a society which in part is medieval. But anyway, coming to the present, that Obama inherited. We did not go in there because of oil. Afghanistan doesn't have that much oil. We went in there because we were attacked. But that does not negate the proposition that the region is important. What is important in addition to that, however, is how we handle the region. And I think establishing a presence, engaging in trade, creating more options, building more pipelines, east-west routes, new Silk Route, is a way of stabilizing the region and of exercising influence in it.
At least from the point of view of the Pentagon, and I don't know how you feel about this, you often hear when it comes to Iraq, we simply had to show we had the ability to do this. We could not be seen to be weak on the global stage. To what extent is that the issue in Afghanistan now, that if America is going to maintain its dominant power in the region, in Eurasia, it can't be seen to be chased out of Afghanistan by some...
Well, no, I don't buy that comparison. First of all, I don't think we had to go into Iraq at all.
I agree.
I don't think we went into Iraq to show that we're strong. We went into Iraq because we were sold a line of argumentation which was false and which was propagated, intensely to the country. We are threatened because he has weapons of mass destruction.
But we know that they knew there were no weapons.
Well, I don't know whether they claimed they believed it. They claimed it was information. But let's leave that aside. That's an old battle. No need to refight it. Look, we are in Afghanistan because we've been there for 8 years. Now, getting out is easy to say. But by now, if we get out quickly, the question arises, what follows? Is there going to be, again, a very sort of militant regime in Afghanistan which might tolerate al-Qaeda's presence? And beyond that, there is now a new issue, namely the conflict in Afghanistan has come to be connected with the conflict in Pakistan. Pakistan is an important country of 170 million people which has nuclear weapons and delivery systems to the entire region around. So we have to think much more responsibly on how to deal with this problem. And I sympathize with the president's dilemma. And then last but not least, add to it the following. The president now has a very polarized country here. We are very divided as a country. We don't have a bipartisan foreign policy anymore for a variety of domestic reasons. If he precipitously disengages from Afghanistan, he'll be labeled as a defeatist president, as a president who's cut and run. And if things deteriorate dramatically in Pakistan, that will be added to this set of charges. And we could then end up, in reaction, doing even more irrational things. So I think he was over a barrel. My own personal view is, and after all, that's all I can express, is that we have to strive as effectively as we can, one, to Afghanize the effort against the Taliban. It shouldn't be waged by Americans, because then we'll repeat what happened to the Soviets. Secondly, we have to, in some fashion, cut a deal with some elements of the Taliban that are not really hooked into the al-Qaeda line. They have a concept of what they want in Afghanistan, but they're not necessarily committed to a global sort of jihad against the West, like al-Qaeda is. And third, just as important as the previous two, we have to find a way of helping Pakistan cope with its problem in Pakistan, but also help us cope with our problem in Afghanistan. And that raises an extraordinarily complicated question, namely, how do we give the Pakistanis the reassurance they want that if we leave Afghanistan, there's not a regime in Afghanistan other than the Taliban which is more friendly to India than to Pakistan?
Right now, if we talk about what is the Eurasia strategy, it seems to be based on an American-Indian alliance. That's not talked about all that much because I guess it might inflame opinion in Pakistan.
Well, that's for sure.
But the American-Indian alliance seems to be the linchpin of the Eurasia strategy.
Well, if it is, then I don't understand what the Eurasia strategy is, because if that is the alliance, then we're not going to solve the Afghan question. And if we don't solve the Afghan question, but the conflict continues, how will the relationship between China and Pakistan, which is quite close, be affected by an American-Indian alliance? And what will that do to the prospects for stability on a larger global scale between China and India?
Is there really any solution without, and this is kind of, I'm arguing against the thesis of your book, meaning does the U.S. not have to start to withdraw as the dominant player in Eurasia and allow the Eurasians to figure this out?
Well, who are the Eurasians? We're talking about
We'll start
Afghans.
with India and Pakistan.
Well, we're starting with the Afghans, the Pakistanis, the Indians, and then the Chinese. You throw in the Iranians, and the Russians. I mean,
well, with the Shanghai Agreement, they're already starting to be cooperating with each other.
The fact is that to some extent our participation in the Eurasian game is also a source of stability and prevents eruptions that could affect us very directly, or our immediate friends very directly. I mean, who are our friends in that region? You have the Europeans at one end, you have the Japanese at another end, we have some friends in the Persian Gulf and the Emirates, we have Israel, Egypt, and so forth. We have to take that into account. We just can't say, oh, this is for the Eurasians to solve, goodbye.
Wars begin for many complex reasons, but one of the roots of the current war in Afghanistan can be found in a 1979 decision by the United States to fund the Afghan Mujahideen in their civil war against the Afghan communist government. It was thought this could sucker the Russians into an invasion that would lead to the Soviets' Vietnam. One of the people who advised President Carter to sign a secret finding directing the CIA to take such action was his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. In part 2 of our interview, I asked Mr. Brzezinski if he regretted that fateful decision.